Welcome to lecture number 15. We're of course in part 2 of the navigable lecture. Pop open full screen here. And something to keep in mind as this comes into focus for us is that we, at lecture 15, we're of course still in North America. We crossed into the United States a couple classes ago, but now we've switched into the 20th century. We're going to be dealing with Rachel Carson today, and from here on out, we're going to be in the 20th century. This is a relatively short lecture, but it's an introduction to Carson. The more clearly we focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe around us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. Carson is a wonderful, wonderful writer. You can see succinct little aphorisms like this appearing all over Silent Spring. If there's one thing that Carson does and does effectively, it is communication. She's an excellent, excellent communicator. And with the next few things we're going to be looking at, we're going to be considering how rhetorical strategies like this deployed by Carson can be effective in communicating in both environmental consciousness and prompting us to make changes to our environmental practices. So, where we are now is after Thoreau, and in part because of Thoreau, we increasingly have individuals who have an environmental consciousness, who are aware of the environment. Now, what they do with that environmental consciousness and awareness is another thing. So Thoreau was advocating, in a way, turning away from environmental problems. You'll recall that he doesn't talk at all about emerging technological modernity in his era. He's writing Walden in 1854. So there's an awful lot going on environmentally. Thoreau's not interested in it. Not only not interested in talking about it, but really not interested then. This next step would be actually doing something about it. The people that we're going to read now, well, at least Carson and Al Gore, who we'll be talking about here, and we will be referencing the film An Inconvenient Truth. These people are increasingly going to want to do something about this. They're going to want to try to, both now acknowledging that there are problems, they're going to offer up solutions to them as well. So, background on Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson unfortunately died of cancer in 1964. So one thing to realize is she is principally a journalist, not a scientist. But it's a little more complicated than that, in that she actually had an MA in zoology from Johns Hopkins. But most of her life she worked as a writer for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. Her job was to produce pamphlets and articles, and they were mainly aimed at the general public. As a consequence, she honed her skills at becoming a journalist, becoming a writer. She became very good at it. She wrote 3 award-winning books on the sea around us, just a really great book. Then she gave up her career as a journalist in 1952. She retired. The interesting thing is, the Silent Spring comes after all this, so you see the background of Carson here. Understanding science, with a background in science, not at all a researcher or anything, but on the other hand, the other side of the coin, which made her so effective and perfectly suited for this job, she honed her skills for decades as a very effective writer, someone writing about the natural world. So she was just ideally situated to take on the job that she did. The fact, however, that Carson did not have a PhD, and indeed a woman, haunted her career. So when Silent Spring came out, it's important to note that even before it was published, because it was known that it was coming out, it was serialized beforehand, people in the chemical industry producing biocides, the pesticides that she rails against, tried to have the book stopped from publication. But beyond that, they also set about a project to discredit Carson. they personally attacked her. They repeatedly questioned the fact that she didn't have a PhD, that she didn't have the scientific credentials, that she was, a person writing about this, and coming out in 1962, still very much a misogynistic culture by comparison to ours, which is still kind of misogynistic. But in that culture, the fact that she was a woman writing about science, didn't have a PhD, they just lashed into her, saying she had absolutely no concept of what she was writing about. This was just silly that a woman who wasn't a scientist could take on a subject like this. And the real message was, don't believe anything that she says, because she doesn't know what she's doing. And it became even more vicious than that. And so Rachel Carson was never married, and then the question was, what was her sexual preference? Maybe she was a lesbian. She didn't, show any interest in getting married and having a family the way that you'd expect most women to do, what they should have done, following conventional patriarchal norms at the time. So Rachel Carson caught it from all sides here, unfortunately. It did not stop her from writing it. It did not stop her from promoting the book afterwards, but it was tough for her, I think. And it has continued, this personal campaign and attack against her, believe it or not, into the 21st century. So, and this is, of course, 50 years, on the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring. Chemical industry spokesman Robert White Stevens argued, quote, that if men were to follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the dark ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Carson, incidentally, very sadly died of cancer right after she published Silent Spring. She lived long enough to testify in Congress regarding the use of biocides, but that was about it. But note here, first, if man were to follow, so it should right there be a red herring suggesting why isn't he saying human beings? This is clearly has a certain gender bias to it. But of course, Miss Carson here, the word Miss is the one that you catch on, of course, for two reasons. First, it makes clear that she's a woman, and furthermore, the fact that it's not Dr. Carson, they're Professor Carson, that she just doesn't seem to have any credentials, and it's this woman talking about what she doesn't know. That persisted. It was the initial attack that happened, and it persisted obviously here for 50 years. And now in 2012, going on 60 years and going, I think it probably still continues in the mind of some people. Very unfortunate. So generally about Silent Spring. It helped spawn the modern environmental movement. So we know, of course, now, having read everything that we have, that human beings have been preoccupied with environmental issues for thousands of years. In different ways they show up as early as the Epic of Gilgamesh. But in the second half of the 20th century, it became a widespread movement, especially back where I'm from in Santa Barbara, one of the worst oil spills in U.S. history in 1969. So it not only happened that you have a range of works beginning to address environmental devastation and problems. Silent Spring is the most noteworthy and an early one. You also have indications of real environmental devastation. So, for example, the Santa Barbara oil spill attracted national attention. It was the largest oil spill in U.S. history at the time. The Exxon Valdez is subsequently in the 1980s, I guess, was larger. But here, this was a big one. And I also drew attention to other similar types of similar devastation and scope. Anyhow, so for example, the Great Smoke in England of 1952, 10 years before Silent Spring, where 10,000 people died of respiratory-related illness in a week in London, alerted people that environmentally there were major downsides, problems, lethal problems coming from what we were doing. People then began on a large scale to consider the issues and what we needed to do about them. 10 years after Silent Spring is published in 1970, 1872, the EPA is founded in the United States. So this is the modern environmental movement. It's different than what you could call, I suppose, an environmental movement in the beginning of the 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century, with the Romantics, and then somewhat later with the American Transcendentalists. Insofar as that was an environmental movement too, it was a preoccupation with the environment, of looking toward the environment, caring about the environment, but it wasn't this type in the sense that people weren't interested in sites of environmental devastation for the most part, and they weren't really thinking about what they could do to mitigate or change that. Really, and I don't want to put too strong an edge on it, but they were turning away from issues like that. So it represents a paradigm shift. And this is an important one to note, and it's a complicated one, and it continues today. So people have been somewhat skeptical of science for centuries. The Romantic poets are going to be somewhat skeptical of science. Keep in mind that Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley's wife, writes Frankenstein in the Romantic period. This idea that science going awry, that we're fiddling with the wrong things, and we're creating major, we're doing things we shouldn't do, and actually trying to emulate God in creating life and all. So people have always been concerned about science and technological modernity. However, for the most part, the public embraced scientific breakthroughs, especially as they were, being sold by the various industries that created and used them, especially the new chemistry. However, Carson showed a really dark side of this blind acceptance, and this is important. Again, a general skepticism of science, maybe, but Carson threw into question science more generally, and whether or not we should, just sort of blindly accept it. Now, it needs to be clarified here how Carson does this, right? Because Carson, as you recall, has a background in science with an MA in zoology. So, she's not going to be a radical rejecter of science. That's not the message that we get from Silent Spring. It is, unfortunately, the message that people historically have, in many cases, taken from Silent Spring. So you're going to have a radical group of environmentalists like the deep ecology movement in the 1980s who are going to be very, very suspicious of science in general. Carolyn Merchant writes a book, The Death of Nature, in 1980, and if you read that book as a whodunit, who killed nature, who's responsible for the death of nature, more than any other person in history, the person responsible for killing nature is probably Francis Bacon, the so-called father of modern science. And the message that these people will take from Carson indirectly is that science is bad. Science is the killer of nature. We have to reject science. The ideal state for human beings is pre-science, away from everything that science has done. Carolyn Merchant looks to the year 1500, not surprisingly, 100 years before Francis Bacon, as a time where everything was pretty much perfect, and then science ruined everything. Well, that's not Rachel Carson's message. You can see where people would take that from Rachel Carson, but Rachel Carson her message is, science is not necessarily a bad thing. It can do wonders. If you read her concluding chapter, she suggests that, not the chemical industry, but biological science, which is, the field she comes from, would hopefully have the possibility of solving our environmental problems. We could create, for example, or engineer a way of making the flies that spread malaria, tsetse flies, making them sterile so that they wouldn't spread malaria, and malaria would come to an end. Carson advocates science. Carson is a big fan of science. What Carson wants us to do, however, is to be very careful about the science that we're using, the things that we take from it. We make things like biocides, pesticides, and she wants us to consider it carefully. So again, it's not a rejection of science, but it is a careful consideration of how we use science and what we get out of it. It's interesting, though, because Carson, because she threw attention on one industry, and that is the chemical industry that produces what we call pesticides, she got people thinking about other things as well. So, in other words, if you release these chemicals into the environment, what are the consequences? Well, if you release other things into the environment, what are the consequences? Atomic power, for example, in the 1970s, the sort of skepticism about accepting science, in a complete way without any thought as to what it could do, and how you can affect the environment by releasing materials into the environment that previously hadn't been there. In this case, through radioactive waste, and also it's not what she talks about, but the reevaluation of chemical additives to food products in the 1960s and 70s and today. In part, that's Carson's legacy as well. Again, we're not releasing pesticides into the environment on plants, but we're directly putting additives into food. What are the long terms implications of those additives? Are all the additives good? And people began realizing, of course, in the 60s and 70s that they're by no means all good, that there were in fact carcinogens being added to food at the time. So it caused folks to look at across the board what we're doing, and again, not to reject science, but to be careful about the way we're deploying it. So Carson as communicator, and because this course is a course on literature and the environment, this is really what we're going to focus on here. Carson as a writer, Carson as being able to successfully communicate something. We just saw Henry David Thoreau, a successful communicator. What does he communicate? Environmental consciousness, awareness that the environment is something valuable and beautiful, and something we need to consider carefully. Carson is also a communicator, not that project. Her project is communicating environmental devastation. It's a type of environmental consciousness too, but it has a different end. And we'll see how effective she is at that. Yeah, Carson, as I suggested earlier, was really well positioned because of her decades of experience as a nature writer. Again, she could have just celebrated nature the way that Thoreau did. She had experience at doing that. Her book, The Sea Around Us, in many ways does that. But this is the paradigm shift that Carson affects. She wants to communicate not a celebration of nature, but a concern for nature. And she's very well positioned to do it. And two, she does it in simple and understandable terms. And this is difficult because these are very complex scientific and cultural problems, and with the use of pesticides. And to be clear, she did not do her own scientific research. She disseminated the research of others. This is an important point. So Carson is not a scientist working in the lab. Yeah, she has an MA in zoology, but she's not that kind of a scientist or a scientist at all. But what she can do, however, because of her understanding of science, she is able to translate that into simple and understandable terms. And that's difficult. First off, because you run the risk of turning off your audience if you're too scientific. There's a great story in Stephen Hawking's first book, or actual second book, A Brief History of Time, where he notes that his publisher said to him that every time that you include a formula in the book, you're going to lose half your audience. So as it turns out, Hawkins put just one formula in that book, which is E equals mc squared. Carson knows this too, and it's a challenge then, because you have an audience that for the most part are not going to be have a scientific background. So how then do you communicate these complicated scientific ideas to them in simple and understandable terms? That was Rachel Carson's gift. She was able to look over an enormous amount of research, and it was all there, and it's something to think about with respect to what a communicator can do. In that, for at least a decade and longer, scientists had been drawing attention to this problem, looking at it, and been concerned about what was happening. But these are papers that are appearing, in obscure, refereed journals. Scientists know the issue, but the general public doesn't. If a scientist, a few of them did try to communicate this issue, Well, they may not have been in the best position to rhetorically to, develop the material and get it out to the public. Furthermore, they may have been just focusing on their own particular research and not being able to stand way back and see the forest for the trees. Carson can do that. She's able to look over the material, understand a range of things, and then communicate it. This, by the way, will become the project of many environmental writers after her. We'll talk about him, we'll read him later in the course. Michael Pollan is right out of this model. He's basically a journalist, and what he's able to do is read a range of material, good at researching, and from that he's able to explain it to us in a simple and clear way. Yeah, Michael Pollan is a great example. And Al Gore too, right? So, is Al Gore a scientist? No. Al Gore, though, not a writer, I wouldn't say that he would think of himself primarily as such. His career primarily was as a politician, but that involved being a communicator. That's what he does. He is able to communicate to people. Politicians explain what they're doing, and they do it in simple terms that everyone can understand. That's really the project of these people from now on. And it's interesting to think about because while there are effective scientist communicators who are sort of hybrids of the two, I think a wonderful example is E.O. Wilson. It is also the case that some of the most effective people at getting these ideas across will be people whose main job is as communicators. That's what their training is in Michael Pollan's case, or if that's what their decades of experience is in Rachel Carson's case. Those are the people that are going to be well positioned to effectively communicate what needs to be done here. Yeah. It's interesting to note that, like the Romantics, Carson does romanticize the environment, and she does that. But she also sees it in another way altogether, which is a cool, detached scientist, an object of inquiry. It's interesting to note that later in his life, after he publishes Walden that we read, in his journals Thoreau begins to see himself as a naturalist and begins to write more and more and more like a scientist. But you see here Carson has both two skill sets to employ and two missions. So on the one hand, like Thoreau, she unabashedly celebrates the environment. We're going to look at a moment how she does that in the beginning of Silent Spring. But then, too, she needs to be able to stand back and be like a cool, detached scientist. Well, why do that? Why not just, emotionally be invested in the work the whole time? Well, look at her detractors, though, which she no doubt anticipated, who want to say that she is this sort of wild, hysterical woman who doesn't have any sort of scientific background, is just wildly romanticizing. Well, you can't do that, and neither can someone like Michael Pollan. They need to be able to elicit trust in the reader, trust that they are, in fact, not, emotionally being motivated here, but that they have stood back in very calm, collected way, looked at the facts, and this is what they have to tell us. They're not going to be credible if they can't in part do that. So to do that, once Carson was published, Silent Spring especially, the press that surrounded her often cultivated an image of her as scientist and naturalist. So two images here, Rachel Carson working in a lab, checking some sort of sample, Rachel Carson out looking what here, I don't know, the California condor whose, eggshells are being, or increasingly too thin to actually hatch, which is what she talks about in Silent Spring. Both of these images are wrong. If we put a third image up here, it really should be Rachel Carson in her era with a typewriter at a desk with a pile of books and papers surrounding her. That's the real Rachel Carson that effectively produced Silent Spring. A writer, a researcher, and a communicator. She's not this scientist here. Yeah, she has a background in science. The other picture, yeah, of course she was interested in the natural world, probably like to hike and all, but these are not what Rachel Carson is. This sometimes backfired, however, and again, if you have the image of her as scientist, she's not really a research scientist. She doesn't quite have the credentials that we would hope for a PhD. That's not going to go so well. The other one is as being naturalist. Well, you have the flip side issue, and that is she's too much like Thoreau, right? She's committed, and she cares so much about nature and the natural world that you're not really getting the cool, unbiased detachment of a scientist, which is necessary to be credible here, but instead you're getting someone who is just, too emotional, too moved by the issues, and too distorted, and which would distort her impression of what she sees. So that's a problem. It's interesting to note that many writers have, and I think almost most in this genre of this type of environmental writing have made similar appeals to, as I put here, heart and head. So Gore and Pollan followed Carson's lead in both romantically, and I've capitalized it here to remind us of the romantic poets, tugging at our heartstrings to get us to care. So what do? They just like Shelley, they take us to Mont Blanc. They want us to realize how beautiful it is. They want us to, like Wordsworth, go to the hidden valley where Michael the poet lived. Michael the shepherd lived in the poem, and they want us to care about it. And Thoreau, of course, is the best example of this, to care about nature, about Walden Pond, about your surroundings and all. But then, after we care about it, they want to say that, it's a problem. It's under assault. And to do that, they have to really turn the other side of their image and go back to Rachel Carson. After they're here as romanicists telling about why this is also wonderful and beautiful, now they have to drop into scientist mode and explain how this situation happens and what exactly is going on scientifically. So it's an interesting project, because on the one hand they want us to care, they want to let you know that they care, they want to show you what it is that you need to care about, and on the other hand they want to pull back and be more disinterested. This then creates a problem, right, for Carson and her detractors, and you could say the same of Pollan and Al Gore. You've had detractors on exactly these grounds, because again, you can see these individuals as, on the one hand, being too overly romantic, which is a problem following Thoreau, or trying to do science and they're not really good at it. So it's a problem. But it's at once the strength of their rhetorical approach, and on the other hand, potentially a problem. Carson, and again, we're looking at her now for her rhetorical strategy, how she does what she does. Key to this is avoiding jargon as much as possible, making difficult concepts understandable, and more than understandable, interesting. That's part of the problem. Without its, as I say here, powerful but accessible scientific arguments and graphs, an inconvenient truth would not have been nearly as effective. So the reason, of course, that I showed the film prior to our reading Silent Spring is to see, up a visual on screen of how this works. Al Gore has to put together a narrative in an inconvenient truth. He has to communicate a number of facts, scientific facts. How he does that is just great. I think it's one of the reasons that the film is so effective. I mean, film has had its detractors, of course, and has issues, but if you look at it on the whole, it's very effective. So you remember early in the game, he shows a picture of the Earth, which is great because he is going to be talking about what he at the time called global warming. Now we I think, more usefully refer to as climate change. He wants to show that this is a global problem from the beginning. So, giving you the image of the Earth is just great. And then showing how he does wonderfully how South America and Africa connected together, that it just seems like there has to be a connection there. That's what he will then do with his graphs regarding climate change, regarding putting CO2 into the atmosphere and all. Very, very effective. You remember one of the most effective moments in An Inconvenient Truth was where he gets on what he calls the contraption, which is that little electric lift that lifts him way up in the air, and you see the chart literally go, the graph literally going almost off the chart, just zooming way, way up there, which gives you the characteristic hockey stick graph that's been so controversial. But it's just very effective to see him going up and up and up. It's just very good at making these things understandable, and in that case, very interesting. Arguably, Rachel Carson does the same in Silent Spring. And boy, what a job to do to try to make something like this interesting at the same time understandable when the underlying science isn't always simple and certainly not readily understandable. They both, Carson and Gore, make clear the enormous power of rhetoric. We've seen this throughout the term, right? Effective writers. Virgil's first eclogue is a good one. Johnson's to Penhurst, Thoreau's Walden. They can profoundly shape ideas, bring about environmental consciousness through effective writing. So, Virgil is able to communicate the horror of losing an environment by way of meloboas, by way of a dialogue between two people. So, it wonderfully sets out what's happening outside of the text with the reader. You're a reader, you don't quite understand what's going to happen here, but that's okay. Meloboas is going to convince Tityrus right before your eyes. He's going to just kind of like keep pounding this idea across. Something horrible has happened. He's very upset. But really what's happening is Virgil, rhetorically, is convincing you, the reader. He's using Tityrus to do it. Tityrus is a stand-in for you in a way. And the brilliance of Virgil, and really he's following Plato's lead here with his dialogues, is that he's also using Meloboas as a stand-in, because Tityrus is also going to explain to you that politics and the savviness of the world is also important. Just very, very effective. Thoreau is very effective in communicating environmental consciousness. The way he describes Walden and what's going on there. The difference is, if there is a difference, is that Carson and Gore bring this to a mass market. Well, Virgil, I guess, did too. He's a very influential writer. But Carson and Gore bring this to an immediate contemporary audience on a huge scale. But they've learned their lessons from centuries rather, thousands of years, in fact, of effective writing. That's what they do. And they're bringing it to a huge audience. So what is this specifically that we're talking about, these rhetorical skills? So there's a little subgroup here I wanted to jump in. The best example probably is the title, Silent Spring. You get this 3 pages into the book, you understand the title. Silent Spring, of course, is the fact that springtime, and again, this would be evocative of the pastoral tradition. In the pastoral tradition, which is always set in spring for the most part, spring is a time that not only looks beautiful, not only smells beautiful, the bouquet of flowers and all, but they're the sounds of songbirds singing in the spring. They're there as harbingers to announce spring. Carson is arguing, of course, that springs are now increasingly being silent. The birds are dying. Why are they dying? Because we're releasing these deadly chemicals, what we call pesticides, she calls biocides, into the environment, and they're killing off birds. And not always directly, but indirectly, birds are ingesting these biocides. They're not allowing their shells to have their eggs to have sufficiently thick shells so that they're sitting on the eggs trying to hatch them, and they're in fact breaking. So it's just wonderful. I mean, she could have called this, if she were a scientist, it would have been an investigation into the use of chemical biocides released into the environment and the long-term effect, and that would have been completely uninteresting and boring. Her title was wonderful. It's also somewhat cryptic, so before you know what it's about, you hear it, you wonder, what is Silent Spring? Why is a Silent Spring? Also, has that nice alliteration, SS Silent Spring. Just a wonderful, wonderful title, and from literally here, the title onward, that you're in the hands of a master writer. So She also very astutely and effectively rejects loaded terms. So she notes that these chemicals should not be called insecticides, but biocides, as they not only kill insects, but all forms of plant and animal life, including human beings. So not only is Carson carefully using rhetoric to her benefit, because she's aware of the power of rhetoric, she notes when other people are using it too. So very clever, the writers, the promoters for the chemical industry have christened these things insecticides. And with that, the hope, of course, that these things just kill insects, that they are that targeted, that the science is that careful and precise that it focuses in on one organism. Well, these are coming out of the Second World War for the most part, and science was not nearly so technologically advanced at the time. They kill insects, but they kill all sorts of things as well. So Carson rejects this rhetoric that the science is more advanced than it is and can target just insects, and says, call them what they are. These are biocides. They kill all life. So Carson is great at both seeing the use of rhetoric and playing that game herself. Carson also, and again, you can see how savvy a writer she is here. When she really wants to tug at the heartstrings, she lets others speak for her, such as what she calls a housewife who wrote, "It is hard to explain to the children that the birds have been killed off. Is there anything being done? Can anything be done? Can I do anything?" So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful quote for a range of reasons. First, again, remember Carson has this difficulty that she is not going to seem like an experienced scientist, and she's going to seem too overly emotional. That's the charge leveled against her. Anticipating it, she lets someone else take this position. She doesn't say, as a writer, the narrator doesn't say, it's hard to explain to the children that the birds have been killed off. She lets someone else say this. I'm not saying that she wasn't in fact, written this letter by this quote, housewife. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. Maybe she created it all herself. Maybe she embellished it, or maybe she just saw the power of it and printed it just as it was. But it's just very, very effective here because it allows that person to be the emotional one. She is sort of in a very cool way relating it, but not herself getting involved in it. Jumping on the emotional bandwagon. I mean, clearly, it seems to me Rachel Carson is on the emotional bandwagon. She cares here, but she wants to let other people take the stronger positions. And furthermore, how wonderful this is because it constructs the reader's thinking for them. So, you reading this may be like the quote housewife, or you may be a man or whatever, but you yourself then, at this point, and we're just past page 100 in the book, you yourself should be asking these questions. She's asking them for you. You've read about what's going on. You're already getting a clue that this is a big, big problem. The question emerging in your mind should be the one that gets expressed here for you. Can anything be done? Is anything being done? And then the great question, where she really wants to have you by the end of the book, can I do anything? This is what she wants the reader to. This is where she wants the reader to be in a point where you want to understand it, you care about it, you're emotionally upset by it, and you want to help, you want to do something. She has a stand-in here, this person who supposedly wrote the letter, and again, maybe they did or didn't. That person is a stand-in for the reader. That person is saying for you, the reader, what you can't say because you're not in the book. But she's anticipated that you're in the book. You're already there. It's just wonderful and clever and smart, and more than anything else, highly effective on Carson's part. She also knows how to put things together for us in a way that makes them seem especially powerful. So, talking about chemical weapons here. In the course of developing agents of chemical warfare, Some of the chemicals developed in the laboratory were found to be lethal to insects. The discovery did not come by chance. Insects were widely used to test chemicals of agents of death for man. Well, okay, here's Carson. On the one hand, connecting up these chemical weapons with biocides, what the industry is trying to sell as insecticides. And she wonderfully does this. If you didn't know this fact, just this fact should mortify you, that these chemicals were being developed as chemical weapons to be used against human beings in war. They were developed during the Second World War. The developers, because they know that all life is very similar, actually were apparently, according to her, using insects to test the chemicals. So this is great because the chemical industry knows that these are not targeted as insecticides. That's the argument that's coming across here by Carson. It's very brilliant. They so much know this fact that they use insects to test the chemicals, because the insects, if they die and are harmed, that means that human beings are going to be dying and be harmed. So, the underlying rationale here with the chemical industry is that these are, in fact, as Carson calls them, biocides. It's proven that they're biocides because that's how they prove if they work or not. So, very, very clever. I mean, you should, if knowing nothing else, when you read this book, if you walk away understanding that insecticides were generally, at least initially, coming out of chemical warfare programs in the Second World War, you should be mortified. Again, though, Carson, tugging at the heartstrings, every now and again throws in her own phrases, that these were used to test chemicals to see if they would be effective. Now, what you might say, if you're very cool and detached as a scientist, effective at killing human beings. Her phrase is, of course, as agents of death for man. It's interesting to look at phrases like that in terms of Silent Spring and what she is trying to do more generally. What I mean by that is, yes, she wants to come across as a cool, detached scientist. That's the best way, just to lay out the facts. On the other hand, Carson wants to really get the reader involved. She really wants to pull you in. She really wants to call them what they are. She can't always have, letters from people expressing the emotional side of things. So she has to take that upon herself. This would be an example of it. It's accurate, right? I mean, it's not making a claim that's not scientifically accurate. It's the same as saying that they are lethal agents. That would be fine. But she wants to engage the reader a little more. I think that she hits the balance right in Silent Spring. You could argue that maybe she goes a little too much toward the emotional, that there will be people in the future who are less so. But look, Michael Pollan, 50 years later, inheriting this tradition, he still pulls himself in, lets himself be in there emotionally. He is involved. If you read The Omnivore's Dilemma, written a little over 50 years after this, he talks about making different meals for his family, one trying to come out of the sort of organic foods that he gets at Whole Foods, another one at McDonald's. Yeah, I mean, talking about your children eating McDonald's is pulling the emotional side of things into the equation. So I think that is effective, and I think that Carson does hit the right balance. But it's interesting to see that, like, here she's doing both telling you the facts, that where these are coming from out of chemical weapons projects, and also emotionally pulling you into it. So again, a wonderful phrase here: as the habit of killing grows, the resort to eradicating any creature that may annoy or inconvenience us grows with it. You could just talk about this as the chemical industry, as the convenience of deploying biocides grows. But no, I mean, this is it. This is the habit of killing. This should immediately make you think of something like war, right? People, when they get into the habit of killing at war, that they become sort of insensitive to the death of things. Soldiers have this issue. This is what she wants to talk about, though. This is a habit of killing. Once you're used to killing, once you cross that boundary and kill to begin with, then killing becomes easier. And furthermore, you initially then, and what she's talking about here is a real thing. You identify the most dangerous possible thing, the tsetse fly that's spreading malaria, that's killing millions and millions of people. So that one creature, you think, well, look, unfortunately we have to do something. I mean, millions of human lives are at stake. We have to focus on eradicating that. But then, well, maybe you want to eradicate things that are just annoying. Maybe you have ants in your house that that aren't necessarily killing you or really spreading significant diseases in a big way. Well, maybe you want to get rid of them too. I mean, they're annoying. So she's saying, any creature that may annoy us. Ants are a good example. They may be in your cupboard eating your food. So once you get into the habit of doing this, however, then everything kind of gets I guess you would say it's sort of killing season on anything, and that's what she's suggesting here. But again, really effective rhetoric, the habit of killing. It should pause you and stop for a moment to think about what we're doing. Who has made the decision that sets into motion these chains of poisoning, this ever-widening wave of death that spreads out like ripples when a pebble is dropped into a still pond? Again, you may reject this kind of rhetoric. It's powerful, but it's also effective. She could say here, we need to look very carefully to see who is, legislating and regulating the use of these chemicals in the environment. Her argument here is that, who made the decision? That the people making the decision here are the people who are profiting by selling the chemicals. They're selling the chemicals, they're being used, and that's it. Carson wants to say that someone else should be in charge of this decision. And I suggested or alluded to a few minutes ago that the EPA was set up 10 years after this book to do just that. They're the people who make the decision, not the chemical industry who makes the chemicals, not people who may want to use them, but it is in fact someone who needs to make that decision. But the way Carson expresses it here, into motion these chains of poisoning. Chains of poisoning, because she's going to talk about ecology and how life is interrelated. It's not a bad expression as far as being factual and accurate, but it's clearly meant to be meant to tug at your heartstrings, and nothing more than the following phrases here, right? The ever-widening death that spreads out like ripples when a pebble is dropped into a still pond. Is it accurate? Well, yeah. I mean, this is her notion of ecology, right? So, okay, you target one little fly, the fly gets killed, it seems like the problem is solved. But a bird then eats that fly. The bird then ingests the poisons. They stay in the bird's body. The bird gets killed by a mammal. The mammal then takes those poisons into its body. Those are the ripples in the pond, right? The first one is the poison on the fly in the center, dropping the poison in. But then the next ripple out is the bird. The next ripple out is the mammals that eats that. The next ripple out may be human beings that eat that animal. So that's what she's suggesting. It's not inaccurate, but on the other hand, the image is just so effective, the widening wave of death. It's just, it could have been written by a poet. It is like a poet speaking of death here, so, and yet still accurate. As man proceeds towards his announced goal of the conquest of nature, he has written a depressing record of destruction directed not only against the earth he inhabits, but against the life that shares it with him. So you recall early in the term we read Lynn White Jr.'s article on, in part that we read it in terms of Genesis and the idea that human beings have dominion over nature, and White being critical of that on environmental grounds. White may have been very early to write that article in 1967, but you can see really 5 years before that, this is not specifically made on religious grounds, but it's talking about human beings have this goal of the conquest of nature, and we have dominion over nature in White's and the Bible's terms. Um, it's directed not only against the earth he inhabits, but against the life that he shares with it. This is suggesting that in part this is human history, right? That we've tried to get control over nature, and that there is not just with biocides here, but in general there is this record of destruction of the environment, and it's not only against the earth we inhabit, but against the life that we share it with. This is a radical thought, but it's an acknowledgement at the time. But now we would see it as a pretty common attack on the human condition and the way human beings have inhabited the planet. But she's just very good at effectively communicating this, and then also making you pause here, right? As man proceeds towards his announced goal of the conquest of nature, so you should stop here and say, wait, when was this announced? Why is this a goal? Why is conquest of nature what we want to do? Well, she's suggesting, and Lynn White Jr. will pick up the suggestion and say, well, when was this announced? Go back to the beginning. In the beginning, God created the earth, and a few lines later in Genesis, the goal is that we have dominion over nature. Carson is not suggesting that here, but she is suggesting that by the middle of the 20th century, it seems pretty clear that we have this desire to have, to conquer nature. And then, you as a reader should really pause and think, is that really what we want to do? I mean, we want to live lives, relatively safe lives, free of disease as much as possible, and we want to live comfortable lives, but is that really what needs to happen? I mean, do we have to conquer nature for this to happen? It should give you pause to think about it. It should pull into relief the entire project of humanity, which is what she wants to do here, of course, in environmental terms. The fact that every meal we eat carries its load of chlorinated hydrocarbons is the inevitable consequence is the almost universal spraying or dusting of agricultural crops with these poisons. Again, very, very effective. So to reject the term insecticide and to instead give the more accurate one, biocide, is one thing, but then to make us realize that every meal that we eat, that every meal that you eat, every meal that I eat, now carries its load of these biocides. This is the inevitable consequence of universal spraying. This is what she wants to do, is to bring it home completely. And this is it. This is home, at the most personal level. This is your body. This is where it ends. The ripples of the pond have now come out, and you're one of the ripples here. You've ingested this stuff. And again, this universal spraying is what she wants to do, is she wants to get us to think about, how we're deploying this stuff and the wholesale deploying of it, and whether or not we really need to cut back dramatically and to be very careful about how we're using these things. But just very effective. Every time you put your fork into your dinner now, you should remember Rachel Carson, and you should start worrying. And that's what she wants you to do. She wants to prompt you to action. Not just by tugging at your heartstrings, but by making you aware of, the real dangers involved here. Our line of defense against invading poisons or poisons from within is now weakened and crumbling. So, we should have a line of defense. But wait, where is this line of defense? Who is protecting us against the chemical industry selling this and it being used agriculturally? It's now weakened and crumbling. I mean, it's not there. So we ourselves, again, remember these are developed during wartime. We ourselves are now sort of being attacked by these chemicals, and of course her imagery is our line of defense. This is a military image, invading poisons. The idea here is, if you imagine this in the term she gives us, this is a line of defense. This is a line of soldiers trying to stop invading poisons, who are sort of allegorical, sort of marching in like other soldiers. But now it's weakened and crumbling. There's nothing to stop them. The invading poisons are now coming in and getting us. Just very effective strategy. Again, the argument could be made too emotional, too effective, too emotional. Well, okay, it's meant to be emotional, but where is this inaccurate? I mean, it's an image, and you could just say that we have nothing protecting us from these poisons, which now enter our body every time we eat something. But I do think that this is meant to sort of jar the reader into action. So, being employing emotion here is not inappropriate, and it is effective. So, Silent Spring is filled with examples of her considerable rhetorical skill. I suggest, of course, that you just look it over, and the more you read it, the more you'll see just how effective she is. She's just very good at it. Um, Moving away from her specific rhetoric, it's interesting to note that she employed inherited ideas, such as our idea of natural. We've seen as early as the myth of Gilgamesh this distinction between the natural and unnatural, in that case between what was in the walls of Uruk and what was outside. Um, but as early as Theocritus, what is natural is being privileged more. Theocritus, writing from Alexandria, from the city, very much in that is caught in that binary, and he wants to imagine what's outside the walls, not as something bad and dangerous, but in fact as something good, that we should value. So Carson, very cleverly realizing that since Theocritus for over 2,000 years, we began privileging the natural more, that the unnatural is something that we are a little concerned about. Again, first, urbanization and the problems that it brought. We saw by the time we get to even Blake and before, that it's not just the city, but it's emerging technological modernity that it's an issue. And Carson knows this. She knows that there's this tradition that we prefer now the natural over the unnatural, that clearly this binary is in position, that she wants to start casting these chemicals as unnatural, as not part of nature. It's something that doesn't exist in nature until we brought it into existence. And again, this sort of anxiety, you can see with Frankenstein, the notion that we were able, through science, to bring something into existence that wasn't there before, and with disturbing consequences. Carson wants to play with that. And she's not the only person who does this, but she's a big part of it here. And the net result is the world we live in today, right? Where you go into a store and everyone is vying to have a natural product. The term natural and unnatural from a legal point of view doesn't mean much. It does mean something when it's converted into organic, so an organic tomato is very different in our imagination than one that isn't organic, that one hasn't had these unnatural agents used to create it. So it's very effective, and it does put this all in terms of nature, right? That what is good is nature, and that what we're doing is unnatural and introducing things that are unnatural, and as a consequence, we should be very skeptical of them. Yeah, 60 years ago, this was kind of a hard sell, I think, on the public. The world that Carson helped create, and again, Theocritus and Blake and many others helped create it too, but the world that Carson was especially able to frame is the world we live in today. We live in suspicion of the unnatural. Sometimes people take it to its logical conclusion and be suspicious of anything that's created by science. Rachel Carson wasn't of that opinion. She thought that science could do good, that certain unnatural things were in fact a good thing. But clearly it's causing us, from an environmental point of view, to reconsider what is natural and what is not, in a very biased way toward nature. Yeah. Carson is so effective at talking about and propounding this distinction between the natural and unnatural, which of course other writers have done before, that in fact, if you read Carson, And read a number of the people here, and I think Michael Pollan, you could say the same from the Omnivore's Dilemma, is if you look at it, read her text, you might think that prior to the problem that she talks about, in this case the deployment of biocides after the Second World War, that everything was natural. So read the opening to Silent Spring, the sort of Fable for Tomorrow, which is set in this sort of perfect rural farm area, and you might think that everything then was perfect, because it was all natural prior to introducing these unnatural products, these biocides, into the environment. Michael Pollan, I think, to some extent suggests that, before the industrialization of agricultural practices in the 1960s and 70s through a range of ways, that everything was natural and that the family farm before it was natural. In a way, of course, that's pastoralizing because it wants to suggest that there was this locus amoenus when everything was fine. It's not accurate. I mean, we know now, having just read 5,000 years of Western literature and considered the history of the West from a cultural perspective, that no, it was not natural at all. But it does give the impression that it was. Why Carson wants to do that is pretty clear, right? Because if we then are very careful about using the unnatural, we have a chance of getting what's natural and good back, of getting nature back. Again, some people will take from this a very simplistic message that everything that's unnatural is bad. We should go back to a primitive state. Try to get back to Eden somehow. That's not going to happen, right? That just can't happen. But what can happen is we can evaluate the things that we're using in the environment and consider how they affect the environment. So a major point here is that Silent Spring shifted environmental interest toward toxicity. So we've talked about things like deforestation, urban growth, growth of technological modernity. These are different. There are environmental problems in some ways, per se, but the use of toxic chemicals, which for the most part is a 20th century phenomenon, that's kind of new with Carson. Now, again, to be clear, we saw in Renaissance England the large-scale burning of coal. That's releasing toxic chemicals into the environment in the form of sulfur dioxide. But increasingly, though, with the manipulation of materials on a chemical level, on a molecular level, this is creating things that just did not exist before, cross-linked polymers, whatever. And the concern over there is emerging in the 20th century as science is able to do that more, to do more of it. And again, we had released chemicals in the 19th century. It's clearly the case, but here, as science and the chemical industry is stepping up the project, Carson made the public aware of it in a new way. And again, as I suggested, not only in this case a certain type of chemical biocides, but toxicity more generally. So we should be concerned about the additives we're putting in food. We should be concerned about anything that we're using. We should be concerned about the household chemicals that we're using and whether or not they're dangerous and toxic. And all the things that we use in our life, batteries in our electronic appliances and all those things that potentially release toxins into the environment. So Carson is a harbinger of something new. Again, she's just talking about biocides. People will read Silent Spring and they're going to start thinking about all different sorts of toxic chemicals released into the environment. That's part of her legacy. Also, from a rhetorical point of view, keep in mind that Carson keeps her focus tightly on one particular problem. She does not overwhelm her audience with a frightening range of environmental problems threatening us. Both Carson and Gore each keep a laser-like focus on one particular problem, which they explore in detail. So you can especially see this with Al Gore. The film comes out in 2006. Let's face it, there are a whole range of problems, environmental problems brought about by human action. The notion that biocides are this problem was solved 50 years ago with the creation of the EPA is just not right. I mean, it's still an issue. Al Gore could talk about that. You could talk about watersheds. You could talk about anything. I mean, there's just so many things out there. Excuse me. But What he wants to do is focus on one issue so as not to overwhelm the audience, so to keep a focus on that. And that's what Carson does as well. Carson could have talked about any number of things also, but she wants to keep a focus there. So that's a strong rhetorical strategy, because otherwise, if Al Gore were to, in whatever the film is, 90 minutes tell you about every sort of problem that we have, just sort of rifling through one environmental situation after another, you'd leave the theater just numb and overwhelmed and probably hopeless. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to keep focus on one thing. So it is the case that neither Gore nor Carson write about pollution more generally. So neither address, for example, industrial runoff into rivers and aquifers, or what we talked about before with fossil fuels, the release of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. They don't. They don't want to overwhelm us. Different people now will systematically start going through these things. So Gore, of course, has a very different issue than Rachel Carson. Michael Pollan has his own issue, the foods we eat and how the industrial, agricultural business is being conducted now with things like the introduction or widespread use of hybridized vegetables and so forth. So it is effective, I think, to just stay with one issue, and it's a model that I guess probably it did exist before Rachel Carson, but Rachel Carson is sort of a master at it. And if you want to be an effective, and I guess this is a more general statement to make, if you want to be an effective environmental communicator, look to Rachel Carson, because she's worked a lot of this out already. You can refine hers and all, but look to her. The problem is, so Al Gore is keeping a laser-like focus on one issue, what he calls, 2006 global warming, what we would refer to today more fruitfully, I think, as climate change. It's done at great cost, though. So let's not forget that. So Gore focusing on climate change is great and wonderful, but many people, I think if you ask the general public, where do we stand with environmental issues, or what we need to concern ourselves with, many people would say just that, climate change. They may not see much else as an issue, because they really don't hear much else being sent to them by communicators. So that's potentially a problem. People have critiqued Al Gore for that reason, but hey, these issues all have to be dealt with one by one, and let's let Al Gore do his job of making us aware of climate change. Let's have Michael Pollan do his job, making us aware of other issues. It should be no one's job to do all this. And again, rhetorically, if someone tried to do it all in one work, it's just not going to be very effective. So let's talk a little bit about Silent Spring as pastoral. So both Carson and Gore draw on this idea that human beings once had a perfect relationship with the earth. We as readers probably believe that in America today. It's just, it's not necessarily you have to believe in the biblical account of creation exactly and Eden exactly, but most of us have inherited the idea that the earth is this sort of perfect. There was once a time where human beings lived a harmonious relationship with the planet. What they're suggesting is that what Rachel Carson and Al Gore want to do is suggest that yes, that's true. If you believe it, it's probably true. But we've done something to change that. Paradise has now been lost. And they also want to suggest how paradise can be regained if we act responsibly toward the planet. This is the opening of Silent Spring. There was once a town in the heart of rural America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Even in winter, the roadsides were places of beauty where countless birds came to feed. So this is cleverly using the pastoral tradition. She's setting up a pastoral scene here. This is a perfect time where all life lived in harmony with its surroundings. Everything is fine. This is the locus luminus. Then a strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change. Everywhere was a shadow of death. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound, only silence. So here we are on the second page. She's already explained the title. This is the Silent Spring. But what is this? This is the retelling of the biblical story, right? A strange blight crept over the area. Evil entered the scene. Evil entered Eden. There's now a shadow of death. This is what happens in Eden after Eve eats the apple. Death now enters the scene. So what Rachel Carson is doing is telling the biblical story all over again. She's alluding to also, of course, idea of a golden age or whatever, having been destroyed. Something has happened. We have actually ourselves brought this about. But again, that's the biblical story. Adam and Eve brought original sin into the world. Rachel Carson is telling this story, but now suggesting that, or will suggest, only on page 2, she will suggest in the rest of the book that this can be solved, that we can do something about this. Al Gore similarly opens in Convenient Truth the image of a locus seminis. So if you remember the film, there's this beautiful stream, and he talks about it, and he says, this is really great, and it's beautiful and wonderful, uncorrupted by human beings. We forget that, and now, of course, that stream is going to be threatened, and that's what he wants to do, is make us aware of that. Even though they use pastoral in their introductions, and they use it effectively, they get us imagining a locus seminis under threat, caring about it. They both appeal to, that pastoral scene, but they also spend more time turning away from it, focusing on environmental issues. So this would kind of be like with Thoreau. Instead of writing Walden, spent the first 3 pages talking about how beautiful Walden Pond was, and then turned away and looked back at emerging industrialization and modernity in Boston or Lowell, Massachusetts, or whatever, nearby areas to him. He doesn't do that. He just is staying completely in the pastoral realm, or for the most part. But Edward Vertinsky, of course, he is, completely looking at sites of environmental devastation and problems. He's looking at them head on in a very sober way. And that's both what Al Gore and Rachel Carson are going to do. Their focus is going to be an unblinking focus on environmental devastation. And this is in a way that, they're different than Thoreau. And I think, again, this is not meant to be a critique of Thoreau necessarily. He is of an age and important because he does elicit environmental consciousness. But if there is a danger to his thinking, is that we risk fetishizing and seeking out wilderness and ignoring environmental devastation. And we talked about this, what would happen if everyone did what Thoreau did. But Carson and Gore do not run away from those problems. They unflinchingly face environmental problems, and they encourage us to do the same, not to go out to the wilderness away from them. There are a whole new range of environmental critics that are of interest that find Gore and Carson of interest. So what are generally called first wave environmental critics, they sort of metaphorically followed Thoreau and similar romantics into the wild, and stayed there, just loved the romantic images and the sort of environment that they were asked to, metaphorically step into. Second wave eco-critics, and these are environmental critics after the turn of the 20th into the 21st century, are very careful not to overly romanticize wilderness. They know how rhetorical strategies function. They know what people like Wordsworth and Thoreau are doing, and they're more likely then to direct themselves to sites of environmental devastation and texts that do the same, such as Silent Spring. So what I'm talking about here is the way that scholars now address works of environmental import. A generation ago, early 1990s especially, environmental critics, scholars writing on the field, loved to talk about Thoreau and Wordsworth. Great books were written about them. Larry Buell's The Environmental Imagination. Jonathan Bate does The Romantic Imagination. It's not The Romantic Imagination, but Romantic Ecology is the title of that book. But critics now don't do that as much. We're more interested in sites of environmental devastation, the human cost, issues of environmental justice, and so forth. So it's just something to think about how the pastoral tradition has influenced Thoreau and Wordsworth, and how it also influences Gore and Pollan and others. So that's the first part of Rachel Carson. We will be picking her up again in the next lecture. Sorry this one went a little long, but you see why I had to break it into two, because there's just so much with Rachel Carson. She's just so interesting and important. Okay, so ends lecture 15.